and more with IRETA TV, coming to you today with Mike McKibben, CEO and founder of Leader Technologies. You can find his information at leader.com. And he is, get ready for this, the inventor of social networking. And he's got a very, very interesting story to tell us regarding the history of social networking and all the technology that we're using today. Mark Zuckerberg, for example, being one of the big proponents pushing this technology, may have gotten it from a dubious source. And the story that you're about to hear today is going to be very, very fascinating. So first of all, Mike, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to come on the show today.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Awesome.
Great to be here.
So can you, I'm sure to most listeners it's a pretty brazen thing for me to jump out and say, okay, here's the inventor of social networking. When they go, I haven't necessarily heard of who you are. I thought it was people like Mark Zuckerberg. So can you tell us the history of social networking and how you played into it and how it turned into what it is today?
Okay, that's a long story because it starts in the 90s.
We're ready.
But in the mid-90s, I won the contract to rebuild AT&T's email system. Now, this is AT&T Global, so it handled all the email for their internal operation as well as all their key clients. And I actually took over the development from a group at Bell Labs to build this product, this email product, which Bell Labs quoted $6 million in 3 years to build, and we did it in $1 million in 6 months. And it was during that time that I saw the internet emerging and saw an opportunity to kind of go back to the drawing board in how large-scale collaboration was going to work in a large-scale network like the internet. And what I also saw from my vantage point at supporting AT&T was that the entire tech community, and I'm talking about IBM, Microsoft, AT&T, Novell, you probably remember them, Apple, were all going down, I'm going to point to a right path. They were going a right path. They were going down one direction in how files were going to be exchanged in the new internet. And we could see that that was not the right way to go. So what I basically did is started this company in 97 and put a crack team of developers together here in Columbus, Ohio. And metaphorically told my guys, we're not coming out of this room until we figure out what's wrong with large-scale collaboration. Well, as it turns out, that took about 3 years to figure that out. And then at the end of right before the year 2000, we had a magic aha moment, and we figured out what was wrong with large-scale collaboration. Now, let me give you just one example of why that's a problem. If you, Dylan, want to take an email with, let's say, a 1 megabyte picture in it, and you want to send that out to 1,000 people so that they can all enjoy this picture, you're creating 1,000 copies of your file at 1 megabyte that are pushed out into the network all over the world, wherever your emails are. Okay, so that takes a certain amount of computing bandwidth. Now, if you've got the whole population of the United States doing that, that can bring in any network to its knees. Mm-hmm. And that's what was happening with what's called groupware, which was the most popular type of collaboration product in the 90s. It's still around, called Lotus Notes in some companies. Microsoft Exchange, if you're using the Microsoft product. So what we saw that was a problem. So what we invented was a whole new way of handling files in a large-scale network, where you actually left the file in one place and you sent essentially 1,000 notices to people, i.e. your Facebook profile or whatever social media site you're using, and you post that link to that photo so that the only time it ever actually is transmitted on the internet is when somebody wants to see it. It's not just automatically happening. And there's a lot more to that, but basically that was an innovation, and nobody was doing that. And what we realized is we had patentable inventions. So I did a lot of research and was advised to go to Washington, D.C. and speak with a patent attorney who was advising Congress, the White House, all major corporations, the military, and he had already written the Federal Trade Secrets Act and the Economic Espionage Act. And so we met with him, and on paper, he was the right guy to go to for patents. That's the good news. The bad news is he did ingratiate himself into our company, agreed to be our director, agreed to be our patent attorney. And what we did not know was that while he's doing that for us, he is also IBM's chief intellectual property outside counsel, and that he was advising British groups, one being the Pilgrim Society in England. And what we now know, after investigating this for 15 years, is that he was in the process of advising how this emerging internet was going to be able to unify all of the activities of the intelligence world as well as the tech world and be controlled by the federal government. That's what he was up to. And specifically, he was involved with weaponizing all technologies related to technology, especially communications and propaganda and large-scale collaboration. So that process took many years to kind of play out. And we then, he agreed we had a patentable invention. What we didn't know was that he was in the process of stealing everything that we showed him in our source code, and he was giving it to IBM, just literally giving it his other client. And they formed an organization in late 2001 called the Ibm Eclipse Foundation. And if you know anything about IBM doesn't share anything. They are the largest patent holder on the planet. And they don't share, they own. And yet they formed this IBM Eclipse Foundation with the idea that it would be open source. And that they would distribute the code that they had for this collaborative work to everyone who joined became a member of their organization all at once. And so what we have been able to prove now, and we found it and we proved it, is that as quickly as we were sharing our code with our patent attorney, he was turning around and giving it to IBM secretly, and they were turning around and giving it to everyone in Silicon Valley. And so
through this IBM Eclipse Foundation?
Through this, this mechanism, this nonprofit IBM Eclipse Foundation. And to this day, anybody that does any kind of development work on mobile devices uses something called the Eclipse IDE, or Interface Development Environment, and that is using our code. And so therefore, the implementation of social media was planned to be something that would emerge like a phoenix. Rather than the normal creative process where you build something and you start introducing it and you go through a kind of a bell curve of introduction of any kind of new technology. This technology just emerged. Facebook emerged on February 4th, as well as the other technologies. Gmail had already emerged. And so what we discovered, to our shock, is that the entire tech world got access to our inventions while they were still fresh on our engineering table. And that was facilitated by our patent attorney, Professor James P. Chandler. So that became that was the impetus for us to pursue that. But we didn't know all those things about his conspiracies then. We do now. But then we still we wondered why all these products like Facebook were coming out. And even my son, who was at Harvard at the time with Zuckerberg in another dorm, called me and said, "Dad, this looks like what you've been telling me about. What's going on here?" And I said, "I don't know. We don't know." And that was the beginning. I was an entrepreneur. I expected the patent office to protect us. So we filed for patents. And we actually received our first patent in 2006 for the environment. So this product that everyone's using on the planet is all patented. Mm-hmm. But the fact is, we have all those protections available to us, but also the fact that from the beginning, when they were still trade secrets, they were being stolen by our patent attorney himself. And so the innovation, so let me talk about technology. People wonder, well, how can you patent something like Facebook? Well, if you log onto Facebook and you go share a photo, for example, if I go on and I share a photo on your particular profile, the system behind the scenes is keeping track of the fact that I'm different than you, that I'm on your workspace, and I am adding a file from my profile to your profile. And then you are in turn sharing this with the whole world. So all that mechanism for how that happens and how that file is handled in the internet is all our invention. Mm-hmm. People think, well, that's just the way it's done, and it's always been that way. Well, no, it hasn't. Typically, in the past, it's been files and folders, and so you send a file out to many people, and everybody gets a copy of it. And the way we did it was totally unique, and it's still being implemented that way today. They've given it other additional fancy names. One is called blockchain, and other such devices.
Are you saying blockchain technology is the same thing that you're talking about here?
Oh, yes. Yes, it's just social profiling with a number on it instead of a person's picture. It's just another social account.
Okay.
And all the information related to that coin is just held in the profile. But they had to give it a fancy name and confuse people. And blockchain, well, that sounds good. That's nice and secure. And a chain, well, everybody likes chains. And it's really been a confidence trick on the whole planet. So they've been working at this for a long time.
I have two questions popping into my head simultaneously. I want to talk about blockchain. I'm going to write down blockchain because I'm going to ask the other question first. So it's my understanding that you've been involved in a lawsuit for quite some time trying to recoup damages from your invention being stolen. Are you able to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, before we knew all these things about the conspiracies, we knew that Facebook and everyone else was infringing our patent, and so we teamed up with a very large law firm, and we actually sued Facebook for patent infringement in 2008 in the state of Delaware. In 2010, we got a split verdict. We proved on 11 of 11 claims that we asserted that Facebook was infringing our patent. No question, it was a battle of experts, and we won that. But then the courts started playing games with some obscure laws, and it was something called on sale bar, which I won't get into right now. But they ended up getting the jury confused and ruling against us on that particular point, which had nothing to do with the infringement. It was a technical fiddle. Mm-hmm. And I'm summarizing it. I could talk in legal terms, but on sale bar, that's all you need to know. And so then we went to appeal, and the appeals court upheld the earlier split decision, and we then appealed to the Supreme Court. Well, and they wouldn't hear the case. And what we then discovered is that all of the judges in our case had mountains of Facebook stock. And now we're discovering, this is just something we've just discovered today, that the district court judge's father worked at technology companies dealing with networking worldwide. So now we've just discovered a new conflict of interest. So this judge had no business being on this case. He was a Rhodes Scholar, so he was associated with the British Pilgrim Society. And things we know now, I wish we would have known then, because we would have argued against him. Mm-hmm. Because he didn't disclose any of these conflicts of interest. And he just took the case.
Are you able to go back and say, look, the judge had a conflict of interest here. We want a mistrial, or we want to do this again? Or I'm interrupting your story. I'm getting excited. But
in a perfect world, theoretically, yes. But the state of our federal courts.
Yeah.
It's a waste of time and money.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
In my opinion. Now, that may not be true for a lot of things, but in the area of patents, these guys have the patent system locked down. All of our patents are headed to Britain as soon as they're filed through a company called Serco that was given in 2006 a blanket contract to process all patents for the U.S. Patent Office.
How do you spell
We've
Serco?
Got a British SERCO. It's an acronym, all caps. SERCO.
Got it.
A British company and essentially controlled by the British monarch. And that company, America gave that company the contract to process all U.S. patents since 2006. So what we see is all these intertwined relationships, interlocked relationships, I should say, that meant that we walked into court with our hands tied behind our back the whole time. And yet we still proved in a jury that Facebook is infringing all 11 of our 11 claims. So that's only the beginning of the story, because once we realized that these judges were all conflicted, obviously I thought like you, well, we'll just go back and say they're conflicted and they have to unwind the case. Well, our court system is so locked down with corruption that they never go back and say they're sorry, only if they're forced to. Mm-hmm. We're not looking we're not looking for the courts to do the right thing. We have seen them consistently do the wrong thing. So after a while, you got to realize it's a waste of money. Mm-hmm. That was your first question. What was your second question?
The second question, I haven't asked it yet. The second question was I wrote it down here, blockchain. So something else that was brazen to my ears. Tell me how blockchain is just an extension of your invention, and what I mean. There's always this argument going on of what is the actual value of blockchain, where did it come from, what's its actual security level. And if you're making a comment like that, I have a feeling that you can give us a little more insight on all those topics. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you know about blockchain?
We're really taking it right about face to get into that. Are you sure you want to go there?
Let's save it
because we could take a whole show.
I was going to say, let's have another conversation about that. Let's get everybody excited. Leave them with a cliffhanger on that, and we'll just plan on another show, because I think that'll be an excellent topic.
Okay, great.
Let's talk about the Pilgrim Society. So you mentioned that this lawyer, Professor, James P. Chandler, was advising the Pilgrims Society, unbeknownst to you. Can you tell us a little bit about who the Pilgrim Society is and what they do?
Okay, first, we're not talking about the Plymouth Pilgrims. We're not talking about the Thanksgiving Day picture in our heads of the Pilgrim Fathers. We're talking about a group in London, a political banking group in London that in 1909 formed themselves together, called the Pilgrim Society, and they were basically the chief strategist for how the British Empire was going to reorder its economy around a commonwealth, and that this commonwealth was going to continue the controls of the British Empire with different names and faces. So they were changing the surface to protect the innocent while they continued on with their slavery, with their debt slavery, with their pharmaceutical attacks, and their desire and intent to control all world communication. And that was how we first found them, is because we started realizing that since we were dealing in the area of world communication, that I never thought for a minute as an entrepreneur about who is actually controlling world communication. And I guess I pretty much assumed nobody did, that it was a domain of each state. But we do see a lot of these cross connections between all these countries. And the question is, who's driving that? Who's setting that up? And is anybody setting that up? And so what we've discovered, and I'm consolidating about a 10-year journey to discover this, that the British Pilgrim Society is in control of all world communication and has been so since I would say since the about 1909, 1910.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a group that was the brainchild of Cecil Rhodes, who was the first kind of fascist corporatist that we have in the world. He formed something called the British South Africa Company,
right?
Under Charter of Parliament in the late 1894, 95, when he was also a Privy Councillor for the Queen. And he and a small group, several dozen British aristocrats and attorneys, got together and they decided, what are we going to do to reorganize? Everybody wants freedom out in our colonies. How are we going to keep control of the economies of the British Empire while we, on the surface, agree to some of these, what they call home rule, to give these countries independence? And so they devised this very clever mechanism for doing that. And one of the things, several things they had to control. One was banking, one was communications, and another one's media. And they set out very intently to do that in 1902. In 1909, they held what they called the First Imperial Press Conference. Now, I can tell you that this particular conference in 1909 has been essentially written out of the history books. And we now know why, because this was identifying chapter and verse how these guys planned to organize their takedown of the world. Not their takedown of the world, but rather to make sure that the world was controlled by the British Empire and that America was under their thumb. That was another key aspect of their organization. And so all of these issues we just talked about with communications and journalism and even pharmaceuticals, they were very into merging pharmaceuticals into how they controlled populations going forward.
Right, which is definitely what we see today, for sure.
Yes.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah, a lot of these explorer stories we hear about the Victorian times in England were actually explorers that were going out and they were looking for new cures for Henry Wellcome and the Wellcome Burroughs Wellcome Company, which is now GlaxoSmithKline, by the way. And so a lot of the history that we have of that time is glorified history. It's fake history. Because what we were never told is there was an underlying current of strategy that the British Empire was specifically pursuing to maintain their control over the world. They had the control in the 1800s. The British South Africa Company, or not the British East India Company. And so as they decided that wasn't good, they couldn't just keep sending their armies all over the world and subduing all these countries. And so they had to get more sophisticated with it. And so what they did, with the cooperation of people that started Barclays Bank, with the Rothschilds, with the National Westminster Bank, they devised a mechanism of debt slavery as a new form of slavery that would replace their prior use of plantation slaves, mostly black and brown, and they would expand that to debt slavery, where they would basically take over your life, your person, and put you in debt permanently, so that you would always be at their beck and call. Mm-hmm. And that's in fact what they have been able to achieve, as we're all suffering from right now.
So when you bring up Cecil Rhodes, the first name that comes to my mind is, or I should say the first book that comes to my mind, what I learned about Cecil Rhodes, is Tragedy and Hope by Carol Quigley. We've had some conversations before this call where I've heard you mention that one of the most important things that Carroll Quigley left out of his book, or his books, I should say, because he wrote another one called The Anglo-American Establishment, and I haven't read that one, but I have read Tragedy and Hope, is that Carroll Quigley goes into much detail about who Cecil Rhodes was, what he was able to do, all these various roundtable groups that he set up, and how Cecil Rhodes lamented the fact that the Americas split from the British Empire, and that they wanted to get the America and Britain to merge again. However, he never ever mentions the Pilgrim Society. Could you give us a little more detail why that might be the case?
Well, I noticed that too. I discovered the Pilgrim Society before I discovered Quigley.
Mm-hmm.
And so finally people pointed me to those books. And so we read, and there was a lot of good research in those books. So it's not like they weren't telling truth, but it was selective. And what we specifically did not find is any discussion of the Pilgrim Society, even though that was the most prominent strategy body in the British Empire. So it's like they didn't talk about their Hydra head. They just talked about it,
all the other pieces,
groups around it, yes. So I imagine you've heard of the Council on Foreign Relations.
Of course. Yes. The Trilateral Commission,
Group,
Bilderberg,
Trilateral Commission,
Club of Rome.
The Round Table, Club of Rome. You've heard all of those things. Well, it's interesting that you've heard of all those things, but you haven't heard of the group that's driving them, the Pilgrim Society. And the people probably have heard of the Rhodes Scholarship.
Right.
And I've always had positive impressions about the Rhodes Scholarship myself. But when you look into the history, you realize that Rhodes Scholarship was a very intentional act for Cecil Rhodes and his clan of these guys who became pilgrims, and we're going to use to recruit new people, to new blood, to the forward-looking agenda of the Pilgrim Society. So it was a very specific recruiting mechanism. And so certain colleges at Oxford are total shills for the Pilgrim Society to this day.
Mm-hmm.
And so that doesn't mean that everybody who became a Rhodes Scholar ended up driving the Pilgrim's agenda, but that is where they recruited
the recruiting
their top
ground.
dogs.
Got it.
Exactly.
Got it. And then, one thing that really became clear to me in terms of all these secret roundtable groups and how they organize actually came to me from reading Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. I don't know if you've ever read it, but Benjamin Franklin, as for fun, at least he states in his autobiography, he created this secret group of 12 members. He called it his junta group, where they would meet on occasion and discuss whatever the heck they wanted to discuss, philosophy or science or politics or whatever. And they said, we're going to keep it secret, and we're going to keep it to 12, because we know if we start inviting people, then there's going to be too many people, and it's not going to be as interesting, and it's not going to be as fun. Well, right. As he progressed throughout his life, there became a political thing that he wanted to achieve. I can't remember what it was that he explained in the biography. But he went to his junta group, and he brought the political goal in mind that he had, and he said, okay, here's what we're going to do, or here's what I suggest, is that all 12 of us go to our local communities and we form a local junta group. And then in those local junta groups, you don't tell them that we're meeting. And so what we're going to do in our junta group is discuss what you're going to discuss in those local ones. And of course, in those local ones, you want to get the top members of your community, the most influential people, so we can influence the most influential people. And then he said all 12 weren't able to do it. It was more like 5. But he was able to achieve the political goal that he intended to achieve by setting this up. And I was like, oh my God, that's the perfect description of how these roundtable groups work, right? And so what you're suggesting is that Carroll Quigley, when he's describing all these different roundtable groups, and a lot of them are out in the open now, like the Club of Rome has a website. The CFR has a website, right? And the Bilderberg doesn't have a website, but everybody knows what's going on. But nobody knows about this Pilgrim Society. Are you suggesting that the Pilgrim Society might be this top group where the head people meet, and then maybe they go out to these other groups and influence how these other groups direct their conversation?
That's it.
Yeah. So
when that's interesting that you talk about Ben Franklin's model. That's certainly not a unique model in the history of the world.
correct.
So the issue is, can you pull it off, and does it go anywhere? A lot of them start with great intentions and fizzle. But what we see now from the history of Britain in the early 1800s is that's when the Rothschild brothers fanned out all over Europe, and with the specific intent to facilitate their banks and to loan money to Christian monarchs who did not want to charge usury. So what they did is they provided the mechanism for the monarch to charge usury in absentia.
Right.
And so
the Jews did it so it didn't count, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. The Rothschilds did many of the things that you read about. But who was driving that? It was the monarchs of Europe. And specifically with England, the Bank of England, we now have the primary documents showing all the governors of the Bank of England going all the way back into the 1700s. And what we see in the early 1800s, 1812 especially, we see the Bank of England moving to essentially take control over how currency was going to be handled worldwide. And they essentially took over the Bank of England, and they made the English note, the Bank of England note, as the currency of the empire, and they diminished the use of gold and silver as the primary currencies. And these were all lawyers, by the way. Bank of England has 26 in their governing group. They have a governor, they have a deputy governor, and then they've got members, and they're all attorneys, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
So they did that in 1812. Now, one of the things we just discovered recently is that within that group of 26, they had a secret committee of 4.
Wait, so I'm making sure I stay along with you. So the Pilgrims group is a group of 26, and there's
no.
Oh, okay.
No, forget that. That's
okay. That's something else.
About the Bank of England.
Okay.
So the Pilgrims was in 1902. We're going back to 1812.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Sorry. Okay, you with me?
Yes. I'm back with you.
So 1812, we're talking about the War of 1812. That's when the British sent over their army and burned down the White House.
Right.
And the money they borrowed for that effort came from the Rothschilds. We have primary documents proving that.
Got it.
And so the Rothschilds then turned around and took that profit and turned it into various other loans for making other wars. And that's when they discovered if they can control the money and control the media, which they were already doing in the early 1800s, that they could make endless wars and make profits for everyone. So they always let the monarch in England play along with all their loans. And so they got addicted to this mechanism very early in the 1800s, and they were trying to take over America's banks at that time. They were loaning money many times across the cities of the colonies, but they didn't have control of the banks. So the objective was to get control of the U.S. banks. So by the time of Abraham Lincoln, they wanted to loan money to Lincoln for the Civil War at 36% interest. Lincoln said no, and he started the greenbacks,
right,
which was America's first non-gold-based cash currency. And what they found is that was a suitable mechanism to go all the way through the war without taking any notes from foreigners.
Mm-hmm.
And we believe, I won't go into details here, that was the reason that Lincoln was killed, because he, at the end of the war, would want to continue that mechanism. And they were adamant with primary documents we have now that not happen, and that the British, at the end of the Civil War, needed to see control of American money creation. So we have all these activities that occurred before the Pilgrims were formed, but we're seeing the germination of their mentality. It's all about debt, slavery, and labor. They wanted to control debt, and they wanted to control labor. And if they controlled those two and the ability to create cash, then nobody could compete with them. And so they kept trying to make that happen in the United States. And there was pushback. There's a lot of pushback in our Congress at that time to what they could see was attempting, that they were attempting in Britain to take over the American system. So it's not like it was totally secret. By the time Rhodes came around in 1880, 1885, he devised this mechanism. It sounds like he was it appears he was a quiet megalomaniac. And he created this idea of revising the British Empire, instead of making it a pure monarchy, to make it a federal corporatist, imperial federal corporatist system that would essentially be run by corporations. And the monarch would be there as the center point to protect all of their proponents as they carried out this plan. So you have the monarch whose business can't be questioned. You have the monarch's court, the Supreme Court of England, whose decisions can't be questioned. And you got the Bank of England that's owned by the Queen and run by the Queen. So it was the perfect insider trading system of the world that they believed they had created. And so they were refining that mechanism in the late 1800s. And so they were working on it. And they actually pushed two wars called the Boer Wars in South Africa, where they were starting to seize control of the gold and diamonds in South Africa so that they could fund this mechanism for currency control. And so they had two wars. They started concentration camps during those to basically test Burroughs' welcome vaccines on people to see how vaccines could be used as a weapon of war. We have primary documents on that. And so by 1902, they were close, but then Rhodes died. And Queen Victoria, their sponsor, died.
Ooh.
And so those two events happened in pretty close succession. So as people were gathering from all over the empire to say goodbye to the Queen Victoria and to then coronate, to install Edward VII, that's when the Pilgrim Society organized. And they've specifically called it the Pilgrim Society. In fact, they had their first meeting the day before Edward VII took the throne. And Edward VII was their royal patron for the Pilgrim Society. Now, wouldn't you think with that level of personnel, some historian would be writing about that?
Yeah, I would.
Yeah.
I would think that. Particularly Carroll Quigley, for example, I think should have been writing about that, right? If he's going to be writing along that vein.
I wish we could ask him why he didn't say that, but we can guess that he was told not to say. Because what we see now is that the whole of the propaganda media, the whole propaganda publishing system in the world, was grabbed early by these guys through their surrogates like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and others, J.P. Morgan. Those guys were all taking their orders from London too, by the way. So we didn't have an independent mechanism of finance by the early 1900s.
Are you able to tell us any of the players that were on the original Pilgrim Society, or in the original Pilgrim Society? Yeah.
The founder, they call him the founder, but he wasn't, is Sir Harry Britton, Brittain. Also in the founding group, some of these people are actually listed in their documents as the founders, but we know there are others who were secretly behind the scenes also founders, including Winston Churchill, by the way.
Very interesting.
J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, Lord Alfred Milner.
That was the name I was looking for. Yep.
Lord General Roberts, who was the chief general of the Boer Wars. You've got Henry Wellcome was hanging around there. Baron Henry de Worms, Pirbright, Lord Pirbright, where a lot of the pharmaceutical secret bio for weapons lab type research goes on in West London. Who else? W.T. Stead. That was Cecil Rhodes' biographer. An infamous person who pushed necromancy. He did seances and the like, but he was also a journalist and is attributed the title father of tabloid journalism today throughout the world. And you've got Lord Rosebery, who was prime minister in 1894. He had inherited in 1890 the whole N.M. Rothschild fortune when Hannah Rothschild died at 39. And it was a very useful time for her to die. And then Lord Rosebery comes in, and he's basically the sponsor of the British South Africa Company and everything that Cecil Rhodes and Henry de Worms, who was, by the way, a maternal Rothschild. So what we see is a large presence of the Rothschilds in the Pilgrim Society, but it wasn't just Jews. I don't want people to get that impression, but they definitely had a hand in the financing of what's going on. And by the time we get to 1809, that whole conference was bankrolled by Henry Wellcome.
You mean 1909?
I'm sorry, 1909. Yes.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, so that was biopharmaceutical company. So there you already see the fusion of pharmacy and wireless. Marconi was at that conference. He would have been another one in the 1902 timeframe. So essentially what you see in the formation of the Pilgrim Society is a who's who of the British Empire at that time. And yet nobody talks about it.
And then are you, should I say, hip to who's in it now?
Somewhat.
Are you able to tell us a little bit about what it's going on in the Pilgrim Society now?
It's hard to get their list published, but we do know because his name is on tax records for the Pilgrim Society. Henry Kissinger.
Oh, of course.
Is a pilgrim.
Of course, him. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So, and of course, he's a Rockefeller. The Rockefellers were also in the founding system. There's another guy by the name of Elihu Root that's one of the founders. And Elihu Root was in 1902 helped found the Pilgrim Society in 19, I can't get the dates right. He was also the president of the Carnegie Endowment. He was the founding president of the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. And then he was the founding president of the Council on Foreign Relations. And he was the former Secretary of War in the United States as well as Secretary of State.
I mean, it sounds exactly like I was just describing with Ben Franklin, having the top group
exactly.
And everybody filters down.
Yeah. But they practice secrecy by Cecil Rhodes's written instruction. They practiced Jesuit secrecy. A lot of those guys were Freemasons, so they were familiar with that whole mechanism for keeping secrets. But I don't want people to mistake this as a Masonic order. It wasn't. There are a lot of Masons, and what we see is the Masonic role here was as a recruiting ground, like like the Rhodes Scholars, lower branches. Yes, it was a recruiting ground for prospective candidates because a lot of people were involved in business, and so some of those people rose up to be full-fledged leaders of the Pilgrim Society, but it wasn't exclusively Masonic.
So, bringing this back into the current time and back to, we started this conversation about social networking, strangely enough, right? We went from social networking to the British Empire controlling the world, or working to control the world from 120 years ago to modern day. So at the beginning here, you mentioned how the patents go straight to Britain now through this company called Serco.
Right.
And they look for good ones to weaponize in communication. Can you tell us a little bit about how social networking that you invented got weaponized and is being weaponized today to control communication?
At a high level, we had a different data storage mechanism and model. And first of all, we're Americans and wanted to make sure that what we invented honored the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, especially related to property and privacy. And in the internet world, that's intellectual property. But those manifest as physical properties too, because if you take all the information for a piece of property and pass it around in the internet, there's games that people play. So basically, our data storage model was this. If you host the data, in other words, it's your profile, you own the rules for how that data is shared. No one else. It's your property.
Mm-hmm.
That was our model. That's the way we designed the entire system. What the weaponizers did is they stripped out all of those securities of privacy and security, and they flipped the model and they said, okay, this is the government system, and we're going to let you on it. And one of the things we're going to do is we're going to say everything you put up there is ours. We get access to everything. And so in that long user license agreement that everybody just clicks through and never reads is that all the devil in these details, and that gives the provider, Facebook, Instagram, whatever, YouTube, Google, the right to take any of your information and do anything they want with it and not tell you and not compensate you.
Right.
So it became a honeypot because there's always useful things on these systems that people find handy. So that's how you get hooked. You get hooked into these features. And then in the process, there's all this nefarious activity going on behind the scenes, which initially people weren't worried about. They used to say, well, I don't have anything to hide anyway. But the point is, yes, you do, because you've got your very soul, all of the things you put down there in terms of your ideas and your emotions and all that kind of stuff is all there. And that's your business. Nobody else's business. But in this case, and now anymore, they're getting to the point where they can actually predict what you're going to do next just by the patterns they picked up already.
Right. And especially now, like, I mean, if we're all taking Facebook, for example, if we're all on Facebook on our phones, the phone's got a GPS in it, right? So not only are we posting what we're doing, pictures of what we're doing, our thoughts and our feelings, it's also tracking where we were and at what time we posted that. I think I remember reading somewhere that, you know, because most people have routines in their lives, it's very, very easy to make the predictions that you just said, because you're like, okay, from Monday to Friday, we know you're at work, and then you like to go to this bar, and on the weekends, you like to do this other thing. So we could pretty much say with, I don't know, 92% accuracy what you're going to be doing 3 months from now.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, so remember what we talked about earlier in that the objective was to create debt slaves.
Mm-hmm.
The objective of the British Empire is to create debt slaves worldwide by the control of currency so that you can control labor. That's the objective, and we haven't seen that's changed in their 120 years of existence. So think of the information that you just described as a fence. Once a digital dictator has all this information about you, they can basically put a fence around it. And part of that fence is coming through something called the social credit system. So as they start putting scores on these things they know you're doing, they then can start corralling you and corralling your behavior. And if they punish you every time you step outside that digital gulag and you respond to that and you back off, you're then actually enslaving yourself. You're allowing
it's just a Pavlov dog sort of thing. Yeah, exactly.
And so rather than being a tool of communication, they've made it into an instrument of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Not only digital, but also economic, because what they're trying to do through this blockchain is include money into that whole set of data, so that if they've got control of your bank account and know your spending habits, you can get punished for things that are not acceptable to this crowd.
Like if you buy the wrong thing.
Yeah, if you buy the wrong thing, buy too much of it, you buy 10 jugs of water and you only needed 5. Well, shame on you.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of thing. So it's getting really nasty in China. And that system seems to be coming here. Well, those are all the things that are a part of the weaponization of social media. Or it's really the weaponization of all communication. And because the social media is so tightly tied to advertising and propaganda and communication, it's the ideal propaganda tool. So that's why everybody's gone to it. And that whole issue of propaganda, by the way, is now front and center because we found in 1909, this first Imperial press conference, we found all these pilgrims meeting together. And it was that year that they really started getting their agenda moving. Carnegie was there, Rockefeller, all the British lords and ladies and the king, all participated in this. And in it, they ostensibly started talking about how they could use the new coming Marconi wireless technology to improve their journalism. And by that, I mean W.T. Stead, Cecil Rhodes's biographer, actually wrote pamphlets on what he called government by journalism. These guys were so egotistical that they believed that they were better arbiters of public sentiment than were their governments. Now, I know you look a little puzzled by that.
No, well, no, that doesn't puzzle me. What's puzzling me is in 1902 or 1909, I can't remember which, early 1900s, they're talking about wireless. Can you tell me what do they mean by wireless back then?
Well,
radio.
You've heard of Nikola Tesla, right?
Right.
He invented wireless telegraphy in the 1890s.
Okay.
And then what happened immediately, remember, these bankers have got to control. So what they did is they set up Marconi as the cardboard cutout, and they stole all of Nikola Tesla's patents and threw them under the Marconi wireless label. And the British then cut a monopoly. The British government, the Navy and the Home Office cut a monopoly deal with Marconi Wireless, and they began putting up the radio antennas all over the world. And that was all intended to be another mechanism for controlling information,
right,
and therefore managing their debt slavery.
Mm-hmm.
So when you see it from their viewpoint, they have to have a monopoly on communications. Because if anybody else has got an alternative viewpoint, their power is diminished.
Of course. Well, and I mean, I think that's why we're seeing the censorship. And I'd be curious if this is your opinion as well, is that for a brief moment there, it was looking like the social networking was actually backfiring on them because suddenly everybody was able to communicate too freely and too easily, which is why people started getting kicked off, and we started seeing censorship, and now the algorithms block you, and now we have fact checkers and all this sort of stuff. But there was a point where everybody was communicating more freely, and it looked like the stuff was about to backfire.
Yeah, I think they screwed the pooch in terms of their strategy in the early 90s, in the late 80s.
Okay.
Because they had this new network capability, but they didn't have nearly enough research and development people to make it work, because we're talking about the internet, which is global,
right? And
they didn't have enough personnel to develop for that environment, so they threw it open to the public. Guys like me.
Let you guys develop it, and then we'll rake it in from there.
Well, I don't know how far ahead they thought, but what we do see is that's their mechanism. Is if they want to start a new market, they might let some minor players play, but eventually they'll buy them up.
Mm-hmm.
So you're right. So I think that was their mistake in terms of world communication. That's something they're trying to lock down now. But up until then, guys like me got out there and we actually started inventing stuff. And they liked ours so good that they stole it. But that was all part of this Marconi wireless system. They wanted a mechanism where they could send one communication out from London and that it would be in the newspapers all over the British Empire by that night or the next morning.
Which is what we see now. right?
Exactly. We see something that's almost the same as what they had then.
Have you ever seen it was a video, someone made a collage of it must have been 100 different news stations, and they were
yes, I saw that.
Yeah, where they're all talking about how important it is to be independent, and they played them all over the top of each other, and they're all saying exactly the same thing. Yeah, so it's like that.
San Antonio's Jessica Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our Treasure Valley communities, the El Paso, Las Cruces communities, Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But
we are concerned about some of the irresponsible, one-sided news stories plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and false news
has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these stories are true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think, and this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
That's exactly right. And if you look at the newspapers, even earlier than that, but by the 1900s, the newspapers looked like they just took a bunch of people's texts and published them.
Mm-hmm.
So they were pushing one message all over the world then. And so they got all those newspaper guys together and they said, we're going to make this even better with this new wireless technology. That was one of their discussions. Then at the end of that conference for 2 weeks, they wined and dined them all over the country. They then formed something called the Empire Press Union. And that Empire Press Union, all of the usual suspects were assigned to it from all over the world. And that became the controlling mechanism that Reuters and Associated Press pushed out all over the world. So Reuters and Associated Press have always been British. They've never been American.
Mm-hmm.
And so Reuters, in fact, was at this conference. So we see that happening. So they're unifying their message all over the planet so they can push out one monopolistic message and they can promote their companies all over the world. Now, here it gets even more interesting. A month later, Prime Minister Asquith, who was at the conference, stands up in Parliament and he announces he's going to form new intelligence organizations. And he formed in one speech, he formed MI6, MI5, and GCCS, which is now GCHQ. He formed all these, and he actually said in Parliament that he was going to use recruits for his agents for these new intelligence world from the newspaper men that came to that conference.
Wow. And what year was this again?
1909.
Okay, we're still back in 1909.
1909 is when the intelligence world that we have today was formed, and those guys were the ones that eventually got the FBI started in the U.S., and then the NSA, and then the CIA. We are the creation. Our intelligence organizations are the creations of the British Empire.
I have heard that, but I haven't heard that in specific detail, like you're saying right now.
Well, we've actually gone back and found the primary documents. So I can back this up with judicially recognizable evidence.
That's fascinating. So where I'd like to take the conversation now is, so we've described this pretty bad problem, or I should say you have described this pretty terrible problem that we have. What do you see? So we're standing here. We've got this problem. Right now we're still able to communicate. What sort of solutions are you working on? Do you recommend? What are the solutions to this moving forward?
Well, first of all, people have to realize what the problem is.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a civil engineer by training. And one of the things you know instinctively as a civil engineer is you can't fix a problem until you know what it is. So shows like yours where you're getting the word out what the real situation is. Because right now, most people have no idea who's pulling the gears and pulleys of this, quote, deep state.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can't hold the deep state accountable. You have to give it names. You have to identify the names. And what we have discovered is that it's the Pilgrim Society. But I think people choke every time they say Pilgrim because we are so ingrained of the Plymouth Pilgrims that we can't put another partition in our heads to think, well, somebody else used that name and it wasn't good. But that's in fact what happens. And they actually in their documents talk about how they intended to fool Americans with that name.
Really? Wow. I mean, for me personally, Pilgrim has a plethora of meanings. I mean, you could be a pilgrim from Europe going to the Holy Land during the Crusades because you want to see Jerusalem. But I mean, maybe I'm a little more read up than the average American.
For them, their use of the word pilgrim was going to and fro of the decision influencers between Britain and America. That was their definition of pilgrim.
I see.
So you gotta take care of those Yanks. But when they formed the Pilgrim Society, by the way, in 1902, that was in Britain. Then they formed it at what they called, what was their word? Their exact word was a branch. They formed a branch in New York. So we have always been a branch of the Pilgrim Society in England.
Well, and that's what Cecil Rhodes wanted, right? I mean, I can't remember if this is Carol Quigley. I can't remember if this is Carol Quigley or something I read from somewhere else, but kind of one of the dreams of Cecil Rhodes was that British Parliament would meet in alternating years between London and New York City.
Right. That was in his will.
Yeah.
That was in his will and testament, written by W.T. Stead, by the way.
Right. The last will and testament of Cecil Rhodes. Haven't read it, but I have heard about it. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. It's a fascinating read. No, it is when you want to know what they were thinking and what they were up to. So these always have been kind of vague. In fact, I didn't know anything about it until 10 years ago. I didn't know anything about Cecil Rhodes.
But you ended up coming across it because you were chasing your patent and trying to get justice for the theft. Yeah,
right. We wanted to know who stole our technology, and in unpacking that story, we kept marching back first. 10 years, then 20 years, then end of World War II. And then we started seeing that this RCA company and NBC started doing certain things with communications in the U.S. And now we realize that RCA and the NBC have always been constructs of the British.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's a shocker. And that AT&T was involved in that way back in 1919 after World War I. And what we see is that World War I was nothing but a British experiment to make sure they could get rid of their competition in Germany and in Russia, so they wouldn't have so much commercial opportunity as they went for world domination.
Well, and at the risk of totally jettisoning us off into another conversation that should deserve its own show, you mentioned Russia, which obviously experienced the communist revolution
right
near the end of World War I. How much? So I've read some Anthony C. Sutton, who says that was all bankrolled by basically New York, basically Wall Street and London. Was that part of? I mean, are you able to tie that in as well and say, okay, go for it.
We've got chapter and verse on that. Would it surprise you to learn that communism as a concept was created in London?
No.
Okay. The Pilgrim Society actually hosted Vladimir Lenin in 1902 in London.
Oh, that does surprise me.
What?
I said that does surprise me. Please continue.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have the documents on that. That we got those from a British researcher. He didn't know how it fit into a larger story, but he definitely researched it well. And Lenin made 6 trips to London where the Pilgrims were coaching him on how to seize control in Russia. And so consequently, the Pilgrims bankers, being the Rothschild Group, Barclays, the insider group of the Pilgrim Society were the ones that funded Vladimir Lenin. He actually spent time in Zurich, Switzerland, by the way, and he lived in an apartment right next to the university where Klaus Schwab went to school.
Okay.
Just a few years later, Klaus Schwab, the whole Zurich connection with the Pilgrim Society is an interesting story. But definitely anything happening in Switzerland is subservient to London to this day. And so what they did is they feared Russia as a resource because they have 14 time zones, many more resources than anywhere else in the world, and the British Empire had to control the resources. And so consequently, they had to essentially take over Russia. And so they had this whole idea of Bolshevism or socialism inculcated in the early Bolsheviks and encouraged them and funded them. And in fact, Lord Milner was actually in Moscow just months before Romanov was deposed.
So, and I think I know the answer to this question, but I do want to break it up for anybody listening. So if the British or the Pilgrim Society wanted to control the resources in Russia, why does it make sense to put up this Iron Curtain and eventually, have Stalin in control of it, where you go, well, we can't even see what's going over on the other side of the fence, and these are now like our at least on paper, are ideological enemies. So what's going on there?
You've done a good job of describing your brainwashing.
Yep. I know.
No, I'm not trying to be critical, but I'm trying to make a point here that we all, including me, all believed certain things about what went on at the end of World War II. And you brought up the term Iron Curtain. Do you know who developed that term?
I'm going to guess Milner. Am I close?
Winston Churchill.
Okay.
Winston Churchill.
Okay.
Winston Churchill made that analogy for the first time on March 5th of 1946 with Truman standing next to him. And he declared that there would be a great Iron Curtain fall on the world. Why? They were just our allies a few days before.
Because he was going to put it there?
Because it was the next propaganda story. They had to make a new enemy for this emerging system that they were creating, this global control system. They had to make a new enemy, and Russia was the ideal one, because who's going to get in a boat and go to Russia? Too far away. So whatever stories the media started putting up as the new enemy, we have to keep in mind these debt slave bankers have to have wars in order to overcome the inflation that they create. And so they have to have wars to flush out their holdings so that they can continue to have power over their assets when their currency is deflated. And war is an ideal mechanism for them to do that. And so Russia was created as the new bogeyman. So to answer your question, there's a certain person that talks about the best way to fight an enemy is to be the enemy, and that's what they did. Communism is a British creation, so why would it be an Iron Curtain around your own creation?
Right.
Well, you made up a story. Is what you did.
Well, and then to answer my own question, because I knew the answer to this, is that how does communism control the resources there? And I think the best phrase I heard was actually listening to an interview with Eustace Mullins, if I remember correctly, is that dictators pay the bills, right? If you make a deal with a dictator and they got to kill 200,000 people to mine those sulfur mines, they'll do it. You want the sulfur? Sure.
That's true.
Yeah.
Now, maybe use a different word than dictator. The fact is that Stalin was a creation of the British. So Stalin was, in fact, subservient to the monarch. And this corporatist federalism that Cecil Rhodes envisioned meant that corporations or monopolies would run different industries. And so the idea that the state is the monopoly was an experiment for them in a new way of carrying out their program.
You mean as communism, the state being monopoly over everything?
Yeah, the state's the monopoly over every industry. So that didn't work out so well for them. So they tried again with Hitler Hitler's worked better for them because at least he kept the corporations in place, and those corporations had a certain amount of autonomy as long as they did the bidding of the Reich. And so that was another experiment. So the first one was a British experiment. The second one was Vietnam. All of these wars that we've been in have all been experiments / opportunities to consolidate the wealth of the world into fewer and fewer hands.
And I also want to remark on this is that, so, my mind naturally goes to how high up do you have to go for people to be aware of? You're saying, okay, the monarch is controlling Stalin, for example, which is a hard pill to swallow. Taking the textbook history, the textbook history that
Pilgrim Society.
Okay, so I lived in Austria at some point from 2011 to 2013, and I met somebody there who pulled out of his library a booklet that said Bilderberg Group Summary from like 1970 something or other. And I scanned the whole thing. I've got it in my computer. If maybe I should upload it to the site or something. You could have it if you want. But I read this thing, and in it, it was a summary of the discussion that happened in the Bilderberg group this year or that year, and they were mostly focused on getting the European Union created and how do we change public opinion so in each of these member states so they want to form into the European Union. And at some point at the end, they mention that maybe we were focusing on the wrong thing because we didn't spend any amount of time talking about the communist world and the fact that they have a certain amount of power and we don't necessarily know what's going on over there. Well, if the Bilderberg group doesn't know what's going on over there, maybe they're not as high up as
right.
as they give the feeling that they are. And
yeah, they're useful whipping boys.
They're useful whipping boys. So I don't know how many layers up you have to go before you hit the Pilgrims group, but I mean this plays into the example again. Going back to Benjamin Franklin, if you've got a group on the top that controls the groups on the bottom, and the groups on the bottom they're just arms for the groups on the top, even if they themselves are secretive and they themselves involve a lot of higher members of the community, there's still layers and layers that you can go up top before you finally figure out, or until you finally find who knows what's going on, right?
It's even better than that.
Yeah.
We were always wondering, how do you keep a secret that well? Especially something that's big. Well, what we realized is that, wait a second, the secrecy agreements that our spies sign are very binding, and people get put in prison for life if they break them. The British have something called the State Secrets Act. And so in this description, what you've seen is that they have taken control of intelligence and propaganda in the major institutions in these countries. And so therefore they can slap the cover of state secrets on anything they're doing. So they not only have their own promise of keeping secrets, they use the power of the governments to force any kind of non-compliance into the that's not a good way to say it. So they use the power of the state to keep their secrets is what they do. And that's how they've been able to achieve it. Because you talk to anybody that's in intelligence or doing government work, they'll tell you about the Secrets Act that they've committed to, and they're very reticent to break it.
Right, because the punishment's so great.
Right. And even journalists have that problem. Look at Julian Assange. He was given the information, and
they still continue to come after him. Yeah,
exactly.
So I think we've hit the conversation at least, or we've hit the topic at least on the surface, and have had a whole circle that we've discussed, and we say, okay, we can see what we have here. Did you have any final points based on what we talked about so far that you think it's important that the listeners know before we finish up?
Well, I think that we've got to call the problem correctly, and I think that's really the big objective. We can't fix the problem until we understand it, and that has been my marching orders from the moment that the Supreme Court didn't protect us. And I needed to know why. And in needing to know why, we started looking at, okay, here we have a piece of evidence. We know it's true. We don't know how it fits into the bigger picture. And we kept doing that for years. And eventually the puzzle started fitting together. And what I think has to happen is many of the people in our government, I don't think understand what we're talking about.
Of course.
Or if they do, they're not talking. And I think that the patriots in our government and in our public life need to understand who the problem is and how deeply those people are committed to hiding their identities. And they want people to get confused and to think maybe it's the Vatican, or they think maybe it's the Masons, or maybe it's the Bilderbergs, or the Council on Foreign Relations, and Trilateral Commission, and the Aspen Institute. I mean, there's a lot of names. Bohemian Grove. There's a lot of names out there, and they're all related. And we cut the term that many of our congressmen in previous generations started using, because they could see this from the beginning. They called it interlocked relationships. Mm-hmm. It's way beyond just conflicts of interest. These are interlocked situations where they're taking care of each other. And so we've got to understand those interlocks, because we can't fix it until we understand that. And I think that's the reason we continue to talk about this and continue to do research, because truth is power.
Where can listeners go to learn more about your research?
Well, you mentioned the video that's up on leader.com. That's one thing, but that's limited now because that site's getting so hacked and attacked that we can't keep information up there. But there's another couple sites. One is another group called American Intelligence Media that's carrying a lot of coverage of our situation in our research, and that is aimfortruth.org, and that's number 4, aimfortruth.org. And then another site, Americans for Innovation, is Americans for Innovation, that's number 4, all one word, .blogspot.com. And that has a lot of detailed research. And everything that we have discussed here is all publicly available information. And so our researchers have been able to pack that up into packages so people can start looking for specific topics, and they actually have judicially recognizable evidence that can be taken right into a court. And I know I was discouraging courts earlier, but we've got to get back to fair courts, and I pray for that day.
Indeed. Absolutely. So, Mike McKibben, leader.org. I want to thank you.
.com. Sorry.
Leader.org, something else. Yeah, I went to leader.org to find you, and I'm like, this is not what I was looking for. Leader.com. Thank you. Thanks again for coming on the show. I'd absolutely love to have you back. I mean, we hit several topics that I feel like can go off into their own show. So more than welcome to come back, and I thank you again for taking the time to be on the show.
Nice to meet you, and yeah, let's do it again.